So let's turn to U.S.-China relations. Last week, you made some comments related to thinking that China wants to seize Taiwan on a, as you said, much faster timeline. What are you seeing that made you think that this is speeding up?
What we've seen is this, and it goes back a few years, not a few months. And actually, let me go back, take a step back even further. One of the hallmarks in the relationship, going back some 50 years, was the way that we handled the issues surrounding Taiwan. And in particular, there was a fundamental understanding in the relationship between Beijing and Washington that differences over Taiwan between Beijing and Taiwan would be managed peacefully, that there would be no unilateral changes to the status quo, and that fundamentally our interest was in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That was the basic understanding. And that understanding held for decades. And I think it was very successful in doing a few things. It allowed Taiwan itself to flourish and its people to flourish. It also made sure, helped to make sure that there wouldn't be conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. What's changed is this: a decision by the government in Beijing that status quo was no longer acceptable, that they wanted to speed up the process by which they would pursue reunification. And they also, I think, have made decisions about how they would do that, including exerting more pressure on Taiwan, coercion, making life difficult in a variety of ways on Taiwan, in the hopes that that would speed reunification, but also holding out the possibility, if that didn't work, of using force to achieve their goals. That is what has fundamentally changed. And we've seen that manifested in actions that China has taken, including with various military maneuvers in the Taiwan Straits, the deployment of forces, et cetera. Now, as we see it, this is first and foremost an effort, as I said, to turn up pressure on Taiwan. And as to what Beijing might do and when it might do it, I can't be any more precise than that. But the fundamental change has been this change in China's view that the status quo wasn't acceptable. This should be a concern for not just the United States, but for countries not only in the region, but around the world. Why? Because if there's any crisis regarding Taiwan, we've got 50% of container ships on a daily basis traveling through the Taiwan Straits. The implications of a crisis, if that were disrupted for the world economy, for supply chains, are significant, more than significant. Semiconductors, chips, as everyone knows by now, the 90% of the sophisticated chips are produced in Taiwan. If that were for any reason disrupted, it would have deeply significant consequences for the global economy. The chips that are in our cell phones, our dishwashers, our automobiles, if that's disrupted, if that's taken out of the supply chain, everyone has a big problem. So everyone has a very big interest, I think, in making very clear to all involved, starting with Beijing, that the world does not want to see any kind of crisis regarding Taiwan, any kind of disruption. And the world believes that these differences need to be resolved peacefully, and that peace and stability needs to be preserved in the Taiwan Strait.
So you were just explaining that change that you're seeing in China's approach and the status quo. From our point of view, does that then mean that the era from the US's approach of strategic ambiguity, is that era over?
I think what's very important to recognize from the get-go is the relationship as a whole with China, first of all, is among the most, if not the most consequential that we have. It's among the most complicated, if not the most complicated that we have. And it also can't be reduced to a bumper sticker. We clearly have a competition. And in part, it's a competition to shape what the world looks like going forward. We've really reached an inflection point because the post-Cold War era is over. There is a competition on to shape what comes next, China and the United States are two of the biggest players in that. And we just have different visions for what the world should look like going forward. I think China wants a world order, but theirs would be an illiberal one. We want a world order, but ours would be inspired by liberal values. So there's a fundamental difference, and we're in a competition about that. We're not shy about it. Neither is Beijing. But we also continue to have, and I think the world expects us to have, cooperation on big issues that are affecting the lives of not just Chinese and not just Americans, but people around the world on things like climate and global health. And so where our interests continue to align, we'll continue to look for ways to cooperate. And then, to the extent that the aspects of the relationship are adversarial, we'll clearly stand up and stand up strongly for our interests. We don't look for conflict. We don't want a Cold War. We're not trying to contain or restrain China. But equally, we're resolute in standing up for our interests, standing up for our values. And again, when it comes to Taiwan, standing up for the proposition that's held for decades that these differences need to be managed and resolved peacefully, that there cannot and should not be unilateral changes to the status quo, particularly by force, and that we have an abiding interest in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. That is a strong basic interest of the United States, and one that we're determined to uphold.
So you were just talking about that competition between us, but also that the relationship is complicated. You know, when you saw this weekend Xi Jinping win another term as leader of China and also surrounding himself by even more loyalists, concentrating power even more, does that make your foreign policy approach with China more complicated or in some ways easier because you know exactly who you're dealing with?
First, you have to start with I think a basic proposition that what we can do with our foreign policy, and by the way, with our domestic policy, which I'll come to in a second, is to help shape the environment outside of China in which China makes decisions. We're not going to be doing anything to shape the internal environment. These are decisions that China will make and that we can't make. But we can shape the external environment in which China is acting and making decisions about its policies in the world. That's one thing. One of the most effective ways that we can do that is exactly what we've been doing over the last couple of years. First, making the necessary investments in ourselves so that as we're competing with China, as we're working to shape the international environment for what comes next, that we do it with the strongest possible hand. We just had a almost historic, I would say, historic success with the CHIPS and Science Act, making massive investments in our own ability to retain technological edge when it comes to chips and semiconductors, and not just in their production and making sure that we're producing more here, but also investments in the basic science and research and development that'll preserve that technological edge. Similarly, the Inflation Reduction Act has historic investments in our ability to deal with climate change, in particular by making sure that we're developing the technologies here in the United States to do that. So these investments make a huge difference, and the investments that we're making across the board in infrastructure, in education, as well as in research and development, that goes to our fundamental strength at home, which in turn goes to our standing and strength around the world. But the second piece is this, and this is so vital. One of the first instructions that I got from President Biden in taking this job was to invest virtually every single minute of the day in revitalizing, rejuvenating, re-energizing our alliances and our partnerships. And as necessary, creating new alignments of countries that were fit for purpose on any given issue. And that's exactly what we've done. But a big part of that goes to the competition with China. When we have greater alignment with other countries, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in every other part of the world, then our ability to deal with this competition effectively is enhanced, is strengthened. For example, when we see practices that China is engaged in economically that are fundamentally unfair to our workers, to our businesses, and we want to see changes. If we're dealing with those issues on our own, we're 25% of world GDP, significant to say the least. But when we're dealing together with Europe, with the European Union, with partners in Asia, we might be 50 or 60% of world GDP. That's a lot harder for China to ignore. So this alignment with others, with Europe, with Asia, with other countries around the world, on issues where we have a difference in interests with China, that's a powerful part of what we're able to do to shape the choices that China makes.